All right, let's dive into something that's really been shaking up financial thinking for decades now. We're pulling out the key takeaways today from Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert T. Kiyosaki. The whole thing kind of kicks off with this simple, maybe even, provocative idea that the rich teach their kids about money completely differently than the poor and middle class do.
That really is the core of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Our goal today is to cut through some of the noise, maybe, look at the heart of what Kiyosaki presents,
Yeah.
and pull out the big actionable lessons about, well, financial intelligence and actually building wealth. We're exploring these contrasting philosophies he experienced and the pivotal questions they bring up.
And the big question driving his whole story is really this. How is it that two men, both hardworking, both successful in their own ways, ended up so differently financially? Why did his own dad, highly educated, struggle with money, while his friend's dad, the businessman, built serious wealth? What were those crucial lessons one passed on that the other, well, didn't? Let's dig in.
Yeah, it all starts with this central narrative device, right?
Yeah.
His two fathers, his biological father, the superintendent of education, very educated, he calls him his poor dad.
Yeah.
And then his best friend Mike's father, a successful entrepreneur, that's his rich dad.
And the contrast, it wasn't just about income, because he said both earned pretty substantial incomes, right? But it was about where they ended up. One died leaving, like a pile of bills. The other left millions to his family, to charity. It really makes you wonder, what was the difference in their teaching?
Well, okay, so they both valued education, like a lot, but they pushed for totally different kinds of education. Poor dad was all about traditional schooling. Get good grades, get degrees, find a safe, secure job, scholastic and professional skills. Become a doctor, a lawyer, climb the corporate ladder.
The classic path, yeah.
Yeah,
The one most of us are taught. Get a good education, get a good job.
exactly. But rich dad, his message was completely different. He pushed for financial education. Study to be rich. Understand how money actually works. And maybe more importantly, learn how to make money work for you. His whole thing was, I don't work for money, money works for me. That's a huge flip in perspective.
Okay, so boom. Lesson one right there. The rich focus on financial literacy. What else was different between them?
Oh, their basic mindset around money itself was just worlds apart. Poor dad, for instance, would often shut down ideas by saying, I can't afford it. And rich dad saw that phrase as like a mental block. It just stopped your brain from working on the problem.
Like hitting a brick wall mentally.
Precisely. Rich dad actually forbade using that phrase. Instead, he insisted they ask, how can I afford it?
Mhm.
Now, he wasn't saying go spend recklessly. It was about forcing the brain to look for solutions, to think creatively, to flex that financial muscle.
That makes a lot of sense. One approach shuts down thinking, the other opens it up. And even how they talked about money at home was different.
Totally. One encouraged talking about money, business, investments right there at the dinner table. Open discussion. The other thought it was kind of impolite, maybe even crude, taboo. One said, play it safe, don't take risks. The other taught, learn to manage risk.
And this one always gets people talking how they viewed their own home. Poor dad saw his house as his biggest investment, his number one asset. Rich dad called his house a liability. Said if your house is your biggest investment, you're probably in trouble financially.
Yeah, that definitely challenges a really deeply held belief for a lot of folks. And even small things like one dad paid his bills first thing when he got paid. The other paid his bills last. Kiyosaki had to navigate these completely conflicting viewpoints growing up. It really forces you to pause and think. What messages about money did you receive, maybe without even realizing it? How might those messages be shaping your financial life right now?
Which brings us perfectly to what Rich Dad apparently called the single most important lesson, like the absolute foundation of financial understanding that he felt most people miss, the difference between an asset and a liability.
This is really it. And it sounds simple, maybe too simple. An asset, in Rich Dad's very specific terms, is just something that puts money in your pocket, period. A liability is something that takes money out of your pocket.
That's the whole definition, just based on cash flow.
That's the core of his working definition, yeah. And based on that simple rule, his big conclusion was the rich focus on acquiring assets, the poor and middle class focus on acquiring liabilities. This super basic distinction. He argues it's the fundamental fork in the road financially.
Okay, let's break that down. How does that actually play out? You mentioned the cash flow patterns in the book.
Right. So for the poor, the pattern is pretty straightforward. Income comes in, and it goes straight back out to cover expenses, rent, food, transport, basics. There's nothing left over, really, to build an asset column. It's living paycheck to paycheck.
Okay, and the middle class.
Yeah.
That's where it gets trickier, right? Where people often feel stuck.
Exactly. They earn a salary, maybe a good one. But first thing, a big chunk goes out of taxes. Then their expenses pile up: mortgage payments, car loans, credit card debt. These are all classic liabilities under that definition, taking money out month after month.
And crucially, their house, which they usually see as their main asset.
Under Rich Dad's cash flow definition, it's actually a liability because money is constantly flowing out for the mortgage, property taxes, insurance, repairs, upkeep.
Right. So even if their income increases, maybe they get a raise,
hmm
their expenses just tend to climb right along with it. They buy more liabilities, a bigger house, a newer car, more stuff. They're working harder, maybe earning more, but just running faster
hmm
in that loop the book calls the rat race.
That's it, exactly.
Yeah.
They might look successful on the outside, but their cash flow is still primarily heading out the door. It traps them in that cycle. Now, contrast that with the pattern for the rich. Their income flows mainly from their asset column. Things like rent from real estate, dividends from stocks, interest from bonds or loans, royalties.
So their assets are literally paying their bills, paying for their lifestyle.
Yes, and usually there's surplus income from those assets, which they then reinvest back into buying more assets. So the asset column grows, which generates more income, which lets them buy more assets. It's a positive feedback loop, a virtuous cycle, the opposite of the rat race. Trying to build a financial life without understanding this core difference, Rich Dad warned, is like building that leaning tower of suburbia. It looks okay, but it's built on a really shaky foundation of, well, financial illiteracy.
That leaning power visual really sticks. Okay, so based on that simple cash flow idea, asset puts money in, liability takes money out, if you looked at your own finances right now. Could you honestly tell which direction your cash is flowing? Are you building that asset column or mostly accumulating liabilities?
And it's not just, a lack of knowledge that keeps people stuck in that rat race cycle. Rich Dad talks a lot about two really powerful emotions that he says control most people when it comes to money: fear and greed.
Okay, fear of not having money, I get that one. And greed, like just wanting more stuff.
Pretty much the fear of being broke, fear of not paying the bills. That's what drives most people into the rat race to begin with. They take a job, maybe one they don't even like that much, and work hard, mostly because that fear of not having the paycheck is so powerful. It's like the donk chasing the carrot analogy in the book. The fear keeps them running and running.
And then the greed part kicks in once they get paid.
You got it. Once the money hits the bank account, desire, or greed, as he calls it, for all the things money can buy, takes over. They see something they want, they buy it. Often it's on credit or with money that maybe should have gone towards assets. And that purchase, it's frequently another liability that just takes more money out of their pocket later. So fear gets them to earn, and greed gets them to spend. It traps them.
It's a tough cycle. And Kiyosaki argues that ignorance is what fuels this whole thing.
Yeah, ignorance about how money really works leaves people vulnerable to these emotions. They don't step back and analyze their situation logically. They just react emotionally. They think, if I just had more money, the fear would go away. But without financial intelligence, more money often just means bigger liabilities, digging a deeper hole.
So Rich Dad's advice wasn't about somehow getting rid of fear and greed, because maybe you can't, but about not letting them control your thinking.
Exactly. Learn to use those emotions in your favor. Instead of letting fear paralyze you into saying, I can't afford it, use the desire for something better to motivate you to ask, okay, how can I afford this?
Yeah.
That shift, fueled by controlled desire, pushes you towards finding solutions instead of just shutting down.
Like that example in the book, Mrs. Martin, right? Working for pennies year after year. She was just reacting purely out of fear, wasn't she? Instead of thinking strategically.
Perfect example. Rich Dad's goal wasn't just making the boys rich. It was teaching them to avoid becoming what he called highly paid slaves, people trapped by fear and desire no matter how much money they made. Thinking about your own decisions around money. When do you feel fear or desire pushing you one way or another? Could taking a pause to think strategically change the outcome for you?
That leads nicely into the next big idea. The importance of actually building your financial intelligence, your financial IQ. It's not just about how much you earn, is it? It's about how much you keep and how hard that money works for you. Rich Dad apparently broke it down into 4 core skills.
Yeah, 4 technical skills. First one, accounting. This is basically financial literacy, being able to read numbers, understand financial statements, see where the money is actually going. It's crucial for knowing your baseline and spotting opportunities.
Okay, knowing your numbers. Makes sense. What's next?
Second is investing. This is really the science of making money. Understanding different investment vehicles, strategies, risks, rewards.
The science of it. Got it.
Third, Understanding markets. This is about supply and demand, recognizing trends, seeing opportunities, especially when others are maybe panicking or just not paying attention.
Buy low, sell high, that kind of thing, but deeper.
In a simplified way, yes, but understanding the why behind it. And the fourth skill is the law, understanding the rules of the game, particularly tax laws, and how they can work for you or against you. And this is where understanding things like corporations comes into play in a big way.
Yeah, the book talks quite a bit about how tax laws, which maybe started with the idea of taxing the rich, actually ended up hitting the middle class and the rudest.
Exactly. That whole Robin Hood fantasy, tax the rich, give to the poor. But the rich, being more financially savvy, learned how to navigate the system legally. This is where the power of using corporations, in Kiyosaki's view, becomes this huge advantage.
So what is it about a corporation? Isn't that just like a big company? How does it give an advantage?
It can be a big company, sure. But legally, a corporation can also just be a legal structure, sometimes literally just a file folder with legal documents inside. The key difference is how it's treated for tax purposes compared to an individual employee. An employee earns income, right? Then the government takes its cut first through taxes, and then the employee gets to spend whatever's left over.
Right. Income, then tax, then spend. Standard stuff.
Exactly. But for a corporation, the order's different. The corporation earns income. Then it pays all its legitimate expenses, salaries, rent, supplies, maybe even things like car payments or travel, if they're legitimately for the business. Then whatever profit is left after all those expenses are paid, that's what gets taxed.
Wait, hold on. So the corporation can potentially pay for things like a car lease or travel for a board meeting using pre-tax dollars.
That's the point the source emphasizes, yes. By understanding the law and using corporate structures correctly and legally, the argument is that the rich can significantly lower their overall taxable income. An employee gets taxed on pretty much 100% of their gross earnings before they spend a dime on living. A well-structured corporation pays many expenses first and is only taxed on the remaining profit.
Okay, wow. That is a massive difference in approach. So financial intelligence really includes understanding these legal and tax structures. How might learning these four areas, accounting, investing, markets, and the law, fundamentally change your ability to play the financial game differently? Have you ever considered how these structures might work?
And it goes beyond just understanding the rules. Rich Dad also taught this idea of inventing money. And no, before you ask, he didn't mean printing counterfeit bills in the basement.
Okay, good. So how do you invent money then? What does that actually mean?
It's really about using that financial intelligence we just talked about to see opportunities that other people miss. It's about creating value or creating income streams seemingly out of thin air, but really out of knowledge and insight. The book gives examples like finding undervalued real estate deals nobody else wants, knowing how to use financial tools like 1031 exchanges to defer taxes legally when you sell a property, or even structuring deals where you create things like promissory notes that pay you interest, basically, building assets from ideas and transactions.
So it's not some kind of magic trick. It's applying financial smarts creatively, structuring deals, finding overlooked value, that kind of thing.
Exactly right. But the book really hammers this point. It's not just for the super smart people. It takes boldness. It takes courage. Kiyosaki quotes Rich Dad saying something like, often in the real world, it's not the smart who get ahead, but the bold.
Okay, that's a really key distinction. But what stops most people from being bold then? What are the big roadblocks the book identifies?
Well, the first one is huge. The fear of losing money. Nobody enjoys losing, obviously. But if you avoid all risk of loss, you also avoid almost all opportunity for significant gain. People who are terrified of failing often, ironically, fail to ever really succeed financially. Think of Thomas Edison and the light bulb. How many times did he fail? He saw it as learning what didn't work.
Or Colonel Sanders, right? Getting rejected, what, over 1,000 times with his chicken recipe before someone finally said yes? He didn't let that fear of rejection paralyze him?
Exactly. You have to kind of fry that little chicken of doubt, as the book colorfully puts it. Another huge obstacle mentioned is laziness, but it's often disguised as just being too busy. People are incredibly busy working their job, running errands, living life, but they're somehow always too busy or too tired to dedicate time to their own financial education or to actually building their asset column.
That sounds familiar. How do you break through that kind of busyness that's really just avoidance?
Rich Dad's counterintuitive advice, a little bit of greed, or maybe better put, controlled desire. You need a really strong WIIFM, what's in it for me. You have to clearly picture the reward. Imagine what your life would be like if you did achieve financial freedom, if you never had to work for money again. That powerful vision can be the kick you need to overcome inertia.
That makes sense. Focus on the prize. And the last big obstacle mentioned was cynicism, right? Or listening to the chicken littles.
Oh yeah, the doubters, the people who constantly tell you why something won't work, why it's too risky, why the sky is definitely falling this time. They talk themselves out of every opportunity, and they'll happily try to talk you out of them too.
But the book argues that these times of fear and uncertainty are actually the best times for opportunities.
Precisely. It says, the seemingly worst of times is actually the best of times to make money. Why? Because when everyone else is fearful and selling or hiding, assets often become undervalued. Prices drop. That creates opportunities for those who are knowledgeable and bold enough to look. The example given was about tax lien certificates, yielding something like 16% when safe bank CDs were only paying 6%. Fear created that gap.
So really take stock. Looking at your own life, what opportunities might you be missing right now because you're afraid or feeling too busy or maybe listening too much to the doubters around you? How could you cultivate a bit more boldness and focus on what might actually be possible?
And that ties into really the final key lesson we should touch on from the source material, the critical difference between having a profession and having a business.
Right. Most people have a profession, They are a doctor, they are a teacher, an engineer, a manager. They trade their specific skills and time directly for income.
Exactly. And Rich Dad's advice wasn't necessarily quit your job tomorrow. It was more like keep your day job, but still mind your own business.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning your primary focus, your main effort, should be directed towards building your asset column, your business, not just working harder to get a bigger paycheck from your job.
So the job is really just the engine, the funding source for building the actual assets, the business on the side.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And the focus for that business isn't just on what you do, but on building systems. Think about McDonald's again. Is it the best hamburger you can buy? Probably not. But they have an incredibly efficient, replicable, scalable system for making and selling that hamburger worldwide. It's the system that makes the money, consistently.
That reminds me of the Bill and Ed story from the book, The Water Carriers.
Perfect analogy, yeah. Ed works incredibly hard, hauling buckets of water back and forth all day. He's trading his direct effort and time for money. If he stops hauling, the money stops. Bill, on the other hand, spends his time initially building a pipeline. It's hard work up front, but once it's built, that pipeline delivers water and generates income, whether Bill is physically there hauling buckets or not. The goal is to build pipelines, to build systems.
And that's how you eventually convert that earned income you get from your job, your profession, into passive income and portfolio income that comes from your assets, your systems. That's the pathway to financial freedom.
That is the path, yes.
Yeah.
And building those systems often requires developing what Rich Dad called synergy, having multiple skills, not just being technically good at your core profession. Like the example of the brilliant writer who couldn't sell books. To become a best-selling author, she needed to learn sales, marketing, public relations too.
So maybe it's smart to sometimes choose jobs or seek out experiences specifically for what you'll learn skills like sales, marketing, negotiation, not just for the immediate paycheck.
Exactly. Seek work for the learning potential, because those skills expand your overall financial intelligence and your ability to build your own successful systems later. So thinking about your own work, your income stream right now, is it purely trading time for money? What kind of pipeline, what kind of system could you start building, even in a small way, alongside what you're doing now? What new skills could you intentionally learn next that would really amplify your potential down the road?
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of concepts. What does this all mean practically? Like, where does someone even begin to apply this stuff? The book does offer some practical, actionable principles, right?
It does. First one, and maybe the toughest for many, pay yourself first.
Yeah.
This means when income arrives, the very first bill you pay is to your future self funding your asset column before you pay the mortgage, the credit cards, the utility.
Well, wait, pay yourself before the bills. Isn't that kind of irresponsible? Won't the creditors come knocking?
Kiyosaki argues it's actually the opposite of irresponsible in a way. He says the pressure of having those unpaid bills breathing down your neck is a powerful motivator. It forces your financial genius, as he puts it, your brain, to scramble and find new ways to generate more income to cover those bills because you've already allocated funds to your assets. It forces creativity and expansion instead of just staying in the earn-to-pay bills cycle.
Okay, that's definitely a bold strategy. Take some nerve. What else?
Pay your brokers well. Don't try to save pennies by getting cheap advice. Find good, competent accountants, attorneys, Real estate brokers, stockbrokers, professionals who are successful themselves, and ideally practice what they preach. Their expertise can help you make and save far more than their fees cost.
Good advice isn't cheap, but cheap advice can be very expensive. Makes sense.
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Another principle is be an Indian giver. Now, that's kind of an outdated term, maybe not the best phrasing today, but the underlying concept is about structuring investments so you get your initial capital back as quickly as possible while still retaining ownership of the asset that continues to generate income or appreciate. You're aiming to get your seed money out quickly so your ongoing returns are essentially infinite or something for nothing.
Like finding a rental property deal where maybe the tenant's rent covers your mortgage and expenses, and you refinance quickly to pull your down payment back out, but you still own the property that's generating cash flow.
That's the kind of thinking, yes. Get your initial risk off the table quickly. Also, simple stuff. Learn from history. Remember that huge companies and fortunes often start very small. Action is always better than inaction. And jog or walk areas, meaning physically get out and look around your community. Look for change, look for opportunities, look for bargains. Profits are often made when you buy right, not just when you sell. Shop for bargains in all market stocks, real estate especially when others are fearful and selling cheap.
So be brave when others are scared. Think big. Look for ways to negotiate volume or collaborate. And importantly, that principle of reciprocity. Give and you shall receive. Give value money, ideas, contacts, even just a smile, and it tends to come back to you.
And teach others. Explaining these concepts to someone else forces you to clarify your own understanding. It's a powerful learning tool. The book also touches on something maybe a bit deeper, that real, lasting financial change isn't just about mental understanding. It involves spirit, emotion, mind, and body, like in that diagram shown. It takes emotional strength to manage the fear and greed, and maybe even spiritual strength or deep resolve to stay committed to the path, just like sticking to a tough diet or exercise regimen. Willpower alone often isn't enough. That's where things like the Cash Flow game come in. It provides a safe space to practice making financial decisions, make mistakes, and learn emotionally without real-world consequences.
So the journey itself, the continuous learning and evolving your financial intelligence, that's really the goal, isn't it? Not just hitting some magic number. So maybe the question for you listening is, what's one concrete, tangible step you could actually take this week, based on all these ideas, to move forward? How will you commit to your own ongoing financial education journey?
Yeah, we've really covered the spectrum, haven't we? From understanding those two contrasting father figures to the absolute bedrock of assets versus liabilities, recognizing the emotional traps of fear and greed, the need to build financial IQ through skills like accounting and law, using that intelligence to invent money through finding opportunities and being bold, the power of building systems instead of just having a job. And finally, some practical steps and the mindset needed for real change.
The big takeaway seems clear. In a world that feels like it's changing faster and faster, building your financial intelligence isn't just a nice to have, it's becoming pretty essential for navigating uncertainty and actually creating the financial future you want.
And maybe here's a final thought, straight from the source material, something to really chew on as we wrap up. Money is only an idea. If you want more money, simply change your thinking.
Or about this one? The idea that it takes money to make money is the thinking of financially unsophisticated people. It does not mean that they're not intelligent. They have simply not learned the science of money making money. Which of those ideas resonates most with where you are right now? Something to think about.